Workplace welfare. First aid in the workplace. Employers' responsibilities. Under health and safety law, an employer has a responsibility to make sure the first aid provision in the workplace is sufficient. This includes carrying out an assessment to decide where, how many and what type of first aiders are needed, providing training and refresher training for their first aiders, providing sufficient first aid kits and equipment for the workplace, making sure all staff are aware of how and where to get first aid treatment. First aid needs assessment. All employers must carry out a first aid needs assessment that should consider the nature of the work and workplace hazards and risks, the size of the organisation, the nature of the workforce, the organisation's history of accidents and illness, the needs of travelling, remote and lone workers, work patterns such as shift work, the distribution of the workforce, the remoteness of the site from emergency medical services, employees working on shared or multi-occupied sites, annual leave or other absences of first aiders, first aid provision for non-employees. Considering the nature of the work and workplace hazards and risks is one of the more complicated areas of the first aid needs assessment. The following table, compiled using information from the HSE, identifies some common workplace risks and the possible injuries that could occur. Risk, manual handling, possible injuries requiring first aid, fractures, lacerations, sprains and strains, slip and trip hazards, fractures, sprains and strains and lacerations, machinery, crush injuries, amputations, fractures, lacerations and eye injuries, working at height, head injury, loss of consciousness, spinal injury, fractures, sprains and strains, chemicals, poisoning, loss of consciousness, burns and eye injuries, electricity, electric shock and burns, workplace transport, crush injuries, fractures, sprains and strains and spinal injuries. An employer should consider the risks and identify what possible injuries could occur in order to ensure sufficient first aid provision is available and first aiders are trained to the correct level. First aiders and appointed persons. There are two levels of HSE recommended first aid courses: First aid at work and emergency first aid at work. HSE guidance states employers should ensure first aiders remain competent to perform their role. The guidance recommends that first aiders attend annual refresher training, which fulfills this requirement. Annual refreshers are recommended due to the wealth of evidence on the severity of first aid skill fade. The flowchart to the right shows the HSE's recommended sequence of training. Although rare, if a first aid needs assessment identifies that first aiders are not needed, the minimum requirement is to appoint a person to take charge of first aid arrangements at work. The role of an appointed person includes calling the emergency services if required and looking after first aid equipment. An appointed person is not a qualified first aider.